Today we're going to be talking about persecution. Because persecutions in the church have been going on since it started. And for around 2,000 years, the Christian church has been persecuted. It started really with Jesus, AD 30. He was persecuted his whole time on the earth, and then he was eventually martyred for the faith. And then, honestly, in the time period we're studying, the early Roman Empire, persecution stayed from, we could say, Nero, who was around AD 60, and they stayed until Diocletian, who was an emperor around 280 to 301-ish AD. So we have like a huge stretch of about 300 years that the Christians were actively persecuted inside of the Roman Empire. But it was, in studying this, I was kind of surprised, because I was always kind of taught that it was this like very intense, well, I always kind of assumed, I wasn't taught it, that it was this very fiery, intense persecution that was going on the whole time, and it really wasn't. The time that there was the most persecution in the Roman Empire was under Decius, around 250 AD. But especially in the time period that we're studying right now, like I said, around 50 to 150 or 50 to 200 AD. There wasn't like a government regulated persecution of the church. There was under Nero, during his reign, Rome caught on fire, and he wanted a scapegoat. So he was like, well, it wasn't me. And well, it may not have been him. We don't really know if it was him or not. People are kind of like it may have been him because he was he was insane, like just a horrible, horrible man. But he wanted a scapegoat, so he's like, oh, no, it's probably the Christians. And this kind of like started government interaction with Christian persecution. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about mainly during this time, during this class at least. So Nero dated 60 AD, Fire of Rome. Yeah, this is the one where he would sew the Christians into like the skin of animals and throw them to the wolves, or he would cover them in tar and light them on fire to like for the light in his gardens when people came. Just like horrifying stuff. And I read that and I'm like, it sounds so personal, not personable. But it really wasn't. This is kind of how they operate. All the emperors operated to the kind of elements in society that they didn't like. It was this very intense, these are the people who invented the crucifixion, right? So they're very well versed in these kinds of horrifying arts. The question, though, like in Nero blaming Christians for the fire at Rome, is why would he blame Christians for this? Like, he could have blamed anybody for the fires at Rome, right? And this kind of speaks to, in general, the Christians were already hated by the common man, in general. Like, because he wanted a scapegoat, and he wanted people that, were already disliked. And if people already dislike the Christians, like, well, they'll probably, take the bit a little bit easier because they're not well-liked already. Why is that? I think when we're talking about the Jews before, like the Jewish interaction with Christians before, the Jews and the Christians were already like at loggerheads and fighting a lot, so that kind of didn't help at all. And it was causing a lot of dissension stuff inside of the empire because of this kind of like back and forth between the Jews and the Christians. So it was causing disunity in the empire, and Rome really, really, really doesn't like disunity, because really all they have is empire and unity inside of their empire. So any element inside of their empire that's kind of like fracturing the unity, they come down fairly harshly on. But yeah, like I was saying, the persecutions during this time period, they're kind of sporadic. There isn't a government censure against being a Christian at this time. It's really just kind of like one-off, like around different areas. And we kind of know this, and we see this because there was a gentleman called Pliny the Younger. Not to be confused with Pliny the Elder. who I don't know what he did, but I know he has a different sobriquet, so I don't confuse him, because I didn't even know there were two different people. He was alive around 68. Not 68. Late first century. He was a liar during this time period. We have one of his letters he sent to the emperor during this time. His name was Trajan. And basically he's like, okay, so I'm doing my liar thing. I show up in Asia Minor, which is like around Turkey right now, and there's these, they say they found a bunch of Christians, right? And I'm supposed to kill them? Or I'm supposed to torture them till they recant? Like, what are we supposed to be doing here? I like caught a bunch of slaves, and I tortured them, and they call them deaconesses, but I caught them, and I was like, okay, so I heard you guys are eating babies. I heard you guys are having like massive orgies. I heard you guys are doing incest, and I heard you guys, besides eating babies, are also just eating people in general. Is any of that true? And they said no. So I said, okay, that's great. Stop doing that if you are doing that, and recant Christianity. And if you don't, I'll just keep torturing you until you stop. And he's like, was that the right move? And Trajan was like, yeah, sure. So that was kind of the whole letter between Pliny. It's important because it shows us, that Trajan, at least, or the Roman government, they weren't actively against Christianity at this time period. They're kind of like, if somebody came forward with an accusation that you were a Christian, then they would persecute you, or they'd like come after you and be like, okay, are you a Christian? We'll torture you. Generally, it was torture under the rod until you converted to, or deconverted from Christianity. It wasn't really a conversion to anything else. But that's what we found inside of Pliny. And that was kind of the MO, the modus operandi from around Pliny until, like I said, Decius in 250 AD. That's a little bit outside of our scope, and I'll bring that up later because that really brought in a very different aspect inside of the persecutions of the church, because that's whenever the government actively started persecuting the church. Up to this point, the government's not actively doing it, like I said. It's really just kind of word-of-mouth stuff. Often, like I said before, it could have been the Jewish element inside societies. They didn't want Christianity converting all the Jews to Christianity, so they would bring Christians to the government and be like, hey, look, these people are, causing dissensions and troubles inside of the empire, make them stop, and then the government would. But frankly, the government didn't really care until around 250 AD. At that point, it was too late. And Christianity was probably a majority religion at that time already, so there was really no point. They couldn't stop Christianity at that point. But they did. Boy, did they try. So because of this early persecution inside of the church, it created a martyr mindset. I mean, already, like I said before, Jesus was a martyr and Jesus was persecuted. And he promised all Christians that we would be persecuted for the faith, right? Like, this is nothing new. It's deeply embedded inside of our religion. But it's just kind of shocking how quickly that kind of showed up. And we have not a lot, but some of the earliest literature we have from the early church is about martyrs and martyrdom. One of the ones we have is from a gentleman named Ignatius of Antioch.
I wonder if there's something wrong there that's not supposed to.
It's my stomach. I didn't have coffee this morning. I'm a little draggy. Woke up too late. Ignatius of Antioch was alive around the end of the first century. He was a bishop of Antioch, so meaning like head pastor, in the kind of Catholic sense. He was in charge of a lot of different churches inside of Antioch. Fiery man. And at this time, it's so early, we don't really know much about his life besides he was bishop during this time period. And while he was bishop, there was the kind of sporadic persecution that popped up. Everyone was like, hey, look, there's this Christian, this Ignatius guy, he's in charge of the whole thing. You get him, you kind of cut the head off the horse. So they captured him, and they started transporting him to Rome, because he was a Roman citizen, to be put on trial and then probably killed by the wild animals at Rome. But on his way there, he actually was writing letters the whole time. And we have 7 letters that he wrote, kind of like Paul. And they read an awful lot like Paul, actually. He sent them off. He has letters to the Smyrnans. He has letters to the Romans. He also has a letter to Polycarp, who we'll talk about later, because he's another very important figure in the early church. But his letters are really important because they kind of show us the mentality not only of martyrs during this time period, but also just how bishops kind of thought in general during this time period. And it's really, really refreshing. I've read quite a bit of the literature now, and it's very personable. He's a bishop, so like he knows all these people he's sending these letters off to, and he knows an awful lot of them by name. So he's very like intentional about like, hey, you know, like I miss you, I will miss you, but not enough to stop my martyrdom. So please don't stop my martyrdom. That's like in almost every letter. He's like, please don't bribe these people to like stop me from being killed. He says, I've got to get to God, which is like really quite something.
So, Aaron, so he's a bishop of what? Who? What kind?
Yep, he's a bishop of the Christians in Antioch. Yep. So at this point, there's really only there's either the Orthodox Christian or like the Christians, yes. And then there's there's the Jews, and then there's other schismatics during this time. So like I said before, the Gnostics are there, people who deny that Jesus came in the flesh and have all these other weird ideas. And then there's the Ebionites, which are like people who believed in the Old Testament law, but also believed Jesus was the Messiah, or may not have believed that Jesus was God. So there's like those 2 other elements. Here, I'll write that down. You have Gnostics, and then you have Ebionites. And he actually mentions these people, or really alludes to these people in his letters, because they're causing disunity in the churches that he's a bishop of. Right? So whenever he's writing letters, Gnostic, Ebionites, and then besides these you have the church. They just knew themselves as the church. You know, there's only one, and it's us, and everybody else is wrong. And like you can know us because we teach what the apostles taught. It wasn't that long ago. You know, like 50 years ago they were out doing their thing. So you know, just ask even Polycarp. Polycarp studied under John, right? Like he knew John and heard his teaching face to face. So yeah, he's a bishop of just the church at Antioch. He is, very, very excited about his coming martyrdom. I'm not excited, he's very ready for his martyrdom. We assume he was pretty old. So a lot of his letter is very, it's intense. All 7 of his letters are like really, really intense. He focuses a lot on unity in the body, because of these 2 groups, the Gnostics and the Ebionites. So a lot of his, what we would say, theology in the letters is really him trying to combat these people. So he's like, hey, you know, Jesus came in the flesh. He really focuses on the suffering of Jesus and the body and the blood of Jesus. Part of that to refute the Gnostics, part of that because he's going to be killed just like Jesus. Like he didn't know if he was going to get crucified or not like Jesus. So he kind of he had a very interested focus on that. Also over and against the Ebionites, he would talk about Jesus being the Messiah all the time and Jesus being very truly God and truly the Son of God. Ultimately, Ignatius was martyred whenever he got to Rome. As best we know, we don't have kind of like an acts of his martyrdom or like a story of his martyrdom that we have for other martyrs during this time period. But considering that there's no documentation about him ending up back at Antioch, it's more than likely that he was killed on the way there. So he's the first Christian martyr that we kind of have an understanding of his martyrdom during this time period. Also, probably the most famous martyr during this time period is Polycarp. Now, Polycarp of Smyrna. Like I said, he is said to have studied underneath John the Beloved. Smyrna is in Asia Minor, so like near Greece. His martyrdom story, it's called the Martyrdom of Polycarp. It's the earliest martyrdom literature proper that we have. So it discusses how he was found, how he got to the place he was getting martyred, which is Rome, and then how he was ultimately martyred, which is being burned at the stake. It's a very powerful, powerful piece of literature, and I would suggest reading it. It's very short. It's around 10 pages to 20 pages long. Really speaks to the mindset of the early Christians during this time period. And it's really interesting. So,
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do we still have that same mindset?
I don't know.
I don't know if,
Yeah.
we kind of like where we're at. Don't want persecution. Don't.
Closest one I know, Holly, is Mock Phillips is
Right.
over there.
Yeah.
They're like, moving ahead and doing Christian churches and different things, and they know that Boko Haram's going to swing into town, and they don't even talk about protection or where we're going to get guns, or they're using it as an example, or we're not afraid, or I don't know. Okay.
No, I agree. I think the American church probably isn't quite ready for this yet. By the grace of God, if this does happen, we will be ready. And the Christians that are here will be prepared to lay down their life like Jesus laid down his life. But I know that, across the globe.
I just remember growing up in the church, a church, and they kind of got tired of being persecuted.
Mm-hmm.
And they became more palpable to, and it was, they just got tired of talking about suffering and stuff because it wasn't drawing people in. And and the older I get, the more important I feel that stuff is. And that's what they, it was kind of fire and brimstone from the pulpit, and they quit doing it. And things became less important. Those things that weren't important anymore. We just need to love each other and get along with each other. And those things are important, I understand, but
at the expense of
being the church. And that's, I feel like, why we're where we're at today.
Because we lost
it was called the silent majority, and they never fought anything. Now that is the church I was raised in. So it just became less effective, although the Catholic Church is still the Catholic Church, and when they say the Pope, all attention goes toward him, and but I do recall a time where they got tired of fire and brimstone and didn't, it's like the people had heard enough. We need to focus on love and
flowers,
just
birds
being more palpable and to the community. And like I said, not that isn't important in a lot of respects, but it got away from the consequences of sin.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's like they don't have to be in opposition, That's a lot of the church. And you'll see that a lot in church history is like we set up these false oppositions between each other. And like, don't have to be there. Like, we can preach God's love and we can preach the wrath of God at the same time, Like, that's just the nature of our faith.
Well, we have to preach the whole thing, not just
The part we like.
The part we want to hear.
Right? The part I enjoy hearing. Yeah, because often when we do talk about fire and brimstone, it's fire and brimstone against the other people and not the fire that, the fires of persecution that make us stronger, because that's very, very uncomfortable and very much a part of the history of the church forever. Yeah. So yeah, Polycarp, I don't know what he would think if he saw us now. I think he'd be very happy that we're not being persecuted. I think a large portion of the church during this time, because in around 325 or 300 AD, we'll talk about it, but a emperor comes into play, his name's Constantine, and he ends all the persecutions of the church that were going on up to that point. And the bishops were ecstatic. They were just so happy. They saw him as like equal to the apostles because he, stopped killing their flock. And I think when I think of persecution, I'm tempted to be like, oh, bring it on, but then it's, I think the people who live into it, I don't think Mark Phillips is going to cry whenever Boko Haram stops, like he'll be very happy when it does end. So again, just like the balance of the how we should engage with these kinds of things. Don't paint it like it was something that they liked happening, because I don't think they did.
No.
But they could bear up under it. They were strong. They loved Jesus, and they were willing to imitate him to death.
They knew what they believed.
Mm-hmm. They knew Jesus died for it, and that they were willing to die for it. It's very, very beautiful. And honestly, again, the story of Polycarp of Smyrna, the martyrdom of Polycarp, is I've read it like a couple times now. I probably should read it again. It's just beautiful. Like, he starts off and he's old. He's probably about 100 years old at this point. Just an ancient man who's been bishop for so long. And the persecutions are going on in Smyrna, and they're like, well, he's in this farmhouse, and then he runs away, goes to another one. He's in that one, he runs away, goes to another one. They finally catch him, these two Roman guards. And he could have escaped this time. This time he's just like, I'm just gonna do it, like my flock. And he's up on the top floor of the farmhouse, and they're like, come down. He's like, okay. They're like, the people are coming to get you. He's like, we'll set a table for him, And he comes down. He's like, have food, like wash up. I'm gonna pray. And he stands there. He prays for 2 hours, like just about everybody. Like either like he prayed for everyone he knew, like in that moment, just like lists off, prays for the people about to kill him, And then they get up and they put him in the cart and they leave for Rome. And the whole time, the two people who caught him are like trying to make him stop. They're like, hey, look, like literally, you can just bribe us and like we'll leave. We know you have money because you're a bishop, and like they've done it before. Bishops have bribed us to stop, and he's like, no, like that's not what I'm here to do. That's not why. And so I think that kind of like really messed with their heads. They didn't quite know what to make of that. So whenever he was like, and this portion just really stuck out in the book. Whenever he was exiting the cart to go to his eventual martyrdom, they like kind of push him, and his shins like hit the cart super hard, and like he just stands up and keeps walking, like 100-year-old man, like nothing happened. And that's just that showed me that this is like a real story, because like you don't remember that kind of stuff if it wasn't real. Like it hitting his shins, like he's about to get burnt at the stake, right? Like that's so much more, but there's something about getting really beat in the shins that like you remember when that happens, like. And so he gets into the Roman Colosseum, and he goes before the judge. The judge is like, hey, like you're an old man, like just recant, you'll be fine. Like you can live out what remains of your days well and not get burnt at the stake. And he says, for 80 years, Jesus has been Lord of my life. I can't recant him now. And goes off, and there's at this part, I think some of the legends kind of come in. They say he was brought out to the wolves, and the wolves didn't want to eat him, kind of like Daniel in the lion's den, so they put him up on the stake to kill him at the stake, and they stab him before he goes up, and his blood puts out the flames, so then they have to relight it, and then ultimately he is killed. And his remains are taken by his body of believers in Smyrna, and they are kind of hallowed. They're set away, and on the day of his death, they had special church services to remember his death. So it was intense, honestly. When I read it, reminded me a lot of the Jewish persecutions during World War II. You know, like they're chasing them down, and they ultimately find him. Just like the horror. That was one of the things that kind of stuck out to me, was just the horror of it. You know, like this is a 100-year-old man whose reaction when he is caught is like, all right, set a table. Like, I'm going to pray. Like, just very, very incredible story. I'd suggest reading it again. Very short. You can find it on the internet for free. Like you said, kind of gets you thinking in a different way from the way I think America kind of interacts with persecutions and martyrdom. So those are two, I think, executive ways that the church proper interacted with persecution. But there was other groups inside of the church, or that ultimately left the church, that also interacted with persecution. Heretical groups or schismatic groups. One of them was called the Montanists. So if we have the early church, the true church, interacting with martyrdom in a kind of stead manner, they are like, if the persecution comes to us, we will go to our deaths and we will die for Christ, because this is what it is. We're not going to go seek it out, because that's kind of wild. Why would you do that? The Montanists would go seek martyrdom out. They thought that martyrdom, if you died a martyr, you would immediately go to heaven, right? And actually, the martyrdom of Polycarp mentions these people inside of it. They say because whenever Polycarp was caught, a couple of these Montanists ran forward to be martyred as well. But then when they finally got to the killing floor, they started weeping and crying and trying to run away and just making fools of themselves, because, I mean, ultimately they didn't know what they were signing up for. But then you had Polycarp just standing in the middle of the 100-year-old man standing there taking it like Jesus did. So we know they were doing that. Who are Montanists? Montanus was he was a convert into Christianity. We don't really know what he converted out of. Probably just the normal religious milieu of Rome during that time period, kind of polytheistic, kind of ecstatic. He believed in the continuing prophecy. He had two prophetic...
I'm trying to shut it off.
You're fine. He had two prophetesses who would go around with him. And they believed that the prophecies that they had were genuine revelations from God. So at the same level as the Bible that we have, or the prophecies that they were given, Montanism is also known as the New Prophecy during this time period. It lasts for probably around 100, 200 years. Like I kind of said before in the last class, Tertullian, who we mentioned before, he converts into Montanism. What is kind of drawing people to Montanism is the continued sign gifts, or like that kind of like spirit coming upon people. Like I said before, it's kind of like Pentecostalism is today, because it's also incredibly rigorous. Very ascetic, very, very, very moral. It's a very moral religion. It lasts for probably around 100, 200 years before it ultimately kind of gets wiped out, or the elements that were part of it get brought back into the true church. We don't really know if it was a heresy. They believed in God. They believed in the Trinity. They believed that Jesus died, rose again, died for our sins, the forgiveness of sins, all of that. They just had these different focuses, and I think the scariest focus that they had was definitely on continuing prophecy. How do you regulate that? How do you decide what the person is saying is actually what God said, or just somebody making stuff up? This is probably why it kind of died off after a couple hundred years, because you can't have everybody running around saying they're a direct spokesperson of God without like great confusion, right? So they interacted with the persecutions. Like I said, they believed that the persecutions were a way to get to heaven immediately if you died under persecution. And because they're super rigorous, they kind of, whenever the persecutions would stop, they would try to kind of stir them back up because this is they just kind of thought that this is what made Christians Christians, was under the fires of persecution, right? During this time period, the phrase, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, was started up, and I think we could all probably very well agree. It was proven multiple times in Rome, and ultimately, through most of church history, that is the case. And whenever they tried to kill Christians, it just made the church grow faster. The last group that we have is a heretical group engaging persecution. They're called the Donatists, named after a presbyter called Donatus. He lived in Rome around this time period. His whole problem, it was also a very morally rigorous sect. And it was operating off the question of what do you do with the Christians who did buckle under the pressure of persecution? What do you do with the Christians who, whenever they came and were like, we're going to torture you to death unless you recant, they recanted. And then whenever the persecutions ended, they were sad that they operated that way. They came back to the church asking to be brought back in. What do you do with them? The Donatists say you don't let them back in. There's no more forgiveness of sins for that. You deny Christ, he denies you. It's a very intense religion. Definitely, clearly made up of the people who didn't buckle under, either they died under the persecutions or they were tortured for their faith. So a lot of the people inside of the Donatist sects were tortured. And so, you went through it all, and then you have these people who didn't coming back and saying, hey, let me back in. I want to go to heaven. It's like, I can see the mentality, the vindictive, no, you don't come back. I went through this. We all went through this, and you want back in? That's unacceptable.
Yeah, but I think of Peter.
No.
Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah.
That's why they're heretics.
And I think
I don't know what I would do at that point, because the last thing I want is more pain.
I know. That's what I know, and I think we, looking back, and even the people during this time period, the church proper, the whole church was like, this is not the way to interact with people who, buckled under the pressure, right?
They were weak, you could say their faith was really weak.
Exactly, they're weak, and there is a sacrifice for that, There is something that can be done for that. Jesus died for this sin as much as he died for all the other sins, So, but the Donatists didn't believe that. This kind of mentality comes up all the time inside of the church, right? We're the true church because we're the most moral. We're the true church because we went through this thing and you didn't, and you compromised, we didn't. But isn't that mentality a compromise with the spirit of pride? So there's no really escaping it. But yeah, Donatism. Again, sorry, I didn't really talk about Donatus himself. He was, like I said, a presbyter. Ultimately, he was made a bishop as well. The whole thing kind of fired up because the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, now, he wasn't known as a Pope back then, but we've read that back onto it. The Bishop of Rome allowed these people who lapsed under the persecutions to come back into the church, and Donatists said, no, like I said, that's unacceptable. And so he started his own rival bishop of Rome at this time. He's the first anti-pope, what they known as. Didn't last very long, that kind of mentality. It does last for a while the people are alive who went through the persecutions, and I think the children's children, but in the same way with the Montanist sect, it just kind of died off of its own accord after a while. The true Christians would engage in dialogue with these people, but I think they wear the condemnation on their face, so it's just a very unmerciful way to engage with the merciful teachings of Christ.
So you think that they're going around, kind of like how a Presbyterian might go around, I'm a Presbyterian. These guys would go around, I'm a Donatist.
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of, this was...
But then, for them, something that may be helpful for you all, it's very helpful for me, the difference between a heresy and a schism. And there's like a difference between the way they think too. Heresies, and the apologists in the church like bring this up during this time period. They talk about the different ways these people think. Schisms, they don't have like theological problems with the established church. Schismatics don't usually have a moral problem with the way the church is running, right? And they don't want anything to do with the church itself. They leave. Like, they go make their own thing. The Donatists were a schismatic group. They didn't really have a problem with the teaching of the church. They were like, yeah, Jesus is the Son of God. Yeah, there is a God who created all things. They agreed with the Apostles' Creed. They agreed with all the teachings of the church. They had a moral problem with the church, and they wanted out. And I think we see this a lot inside of churches all the time, you know, like you have even in our own time period. Like you said, you had at one point this group that was very fire and brimstone, and then it became this not fire and brimstone group. That's like really a moral kind of mentality, and the church is split over that kind of stuff and make schism.
And you know, as a human being, that is so hard to separate because we're always kind of comparing. It's like, oh, they don't. They say they're Catholic. Well, I say I'm Christian.
Yep.
Am I better? You know that.
Yep.
That's making a judgment.
Yep. The pride.
And it's so deep because it goes with everything.
Yeah. I mean, the church has been dealing with it forever. Like, and Jesus talked about it in his final supper, the Last Supper. Heresy is a doctrinal problem with the church. Or at least, and this is the important thing, the church has a doctrinal problem with the heretic. The heretic doesn't care. The heretic wants to stay in the church.
Because if they didn't, they'd just leave.
Right. The heretics, they say, well, the problem, I don't believe Jesus is God, but that's fine. You know, I can still worship with you, right?
I'm still a Christian.
I'm still a Christian, yeah. Like, it's just a difference in perspective about theology. And that's usually how heretics think. They try to stay within the church and corrupt the church inside, and it's the church's duty to go and kind of like find them and be like, you can't teach this, you know, like this is like deadly to the life of the church. So that was kind of helpful for me in studying when I'm studying, like, well, this is a schismatic sect, and this is a heretical sect. And so if I use these terms, that's kind of what I'm meaning. Schismatics leave really of their own accord. Heretics, you kind of have to ferret out.
You have to excommunicate.
You do, because they won't leave. They'll stay. They'll stick around and like I've seen it in churches I was at. People who have like very bad like theology that's like bad for the church, like teaching works salvation, and they don't want to leave. You know, like they want to stay and like convert other people to the way they think, and it's just unacceptable. You know, if you think
it's like yeast.
Yeah, exactly. Little leaven leavens the whole lump. So can't let them stay. Unfortunately, just wish them well, and you know, go hang out with the schismatics. You know, like have fun.
They'll teach you something about theology.
Right. So yeah, that's persecutions. Any questions? This isn't the end of persecution. I have another one with Decius later, but
so this was ranging from like we're still in the 50 to 158.
Yeah, 50 to 150, 50 to 200, kind of. Yeah. Any questions, Ian?
Yeah.
Probably got the best one.
Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, so I just wrapped up, Ian.
Julio.